And then, ladies and gentlemen, director of the film Passing, Miss Rebecca Hall.
Hello.
Hello.
I guess they have us far enough apart that we don't have to wear our masks. I am really happy to talk to you about this film for several reasons. One is, when I was growing up, there was always someone we all knew or had someone in the family or someone that we had heard about in the neighborhood or something, someone, the term passing. And, but I don't think, except for something like Imitation of Life, I had never really seen movies about it, and especially not from the point of view of the African-American character. Tell me, when did you become aware of this novel by Nella Larsen, and why did you decide to make a movie about passing?
Well, it's a long answer, but it was about 15 years ago, and I was entering a phase in my life where I was spending more time in America. My mother's from Detroit, Michigan. Oh, some people from Detroit here. And, but I was born in England, obviously. The accent is quite clear. But there was talk about her father having passed, and I always looked at my mother and I thought, well, that's a black woman. But no one's saying it. I didn't have language for it. I didn't have understanding for it. I didn't even have context. I had nothing. But what I knew that I did have was an ability to start talking about it, thinking about it, spending more time in this country, thinking about that side of my family. And around that time, someone handed me this book and said, this thing that you're talking about, it's this. And I was like, okay. And I read it, and I was just, it was like a visceral gut punch. And that's not
Can someone come help us with the microphone, please?
There you go. Thank you. Yeah, what was I saying? Not because of me so much, because the book is extraordinary and extraordinarily modern. You know, Nella Larsen was just a breathtakingly brilliant writer. This novel is tiny. You can read it in a couple of hours, and it holds worlds. It has the superficial layer of what the story is technically about, and then it has layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, and it only achieves that through this simplicity. Now, you know, 15 years ago, I wanted to be a filmmaker, funnily enough.
You know, in fact, let me get to that point.
Yeah, please.
Because I always knew you as an actor and loved you in many films. Vicky Cristina Barcelona, Christine, Professor Marsden and the Wonder Women. Many, many films. I've seen you on the big screen and the small screen. So I was amazed when someone told me that you were going to be directing this film. Mm-hmm. And I have to be honest with you, I thought, why is this white woman going to be directing this film about passing? What does she know about it? Yeah. And little did I know about your family background. So,
no, I mean, it's a fair question, and you know, I think the question is you know, one that frankly I have been circling too. Why me? Why do I need to do this? What is this for me? And the 15 years that it's taken me to write it and get to the point where we're all sitting looking at it is me learning why, is me understanding why I've had to do this, is me grappling with all of that. And Yeah, but the filmmaking part is another story. I mean,
Yes.
that's something that I've always wanted to do. I mean, I'm a film nerd, not for the acting. I've always painted. My mother's obviously a musician, so I do music. I've never felt like any of these things could be a career on their own, but I've always suspected that film would harness all of those interests.
Your mother was an American opera singer.
Yeah.
And you say that, you know, you're between your painting and your singing, your interest in music, there are a lot of things. So you wanted to be a filmmaker as well as an actor.
Yeah, forever I've wanted to. It's just, you know, my parents were fairly intimidating, brilliant people, so there was a little element of like, you know, my father was a really very serious theatre director in England, and, you know, and also I had the good fortune to be very successful as an actor.
Yes.
And you sort of, you know, once you get on that train, you're like, it's kind of like you got to keep hitting it. It's like, okay, well, I can't stop acting because what if it all falls apart, you know? And so it's difficult to sort of stop and think about doing something else. But
and actually, you know, I just phrased the question like that. I was glad that you decided to become a director because you've been around many directors, you've been around many sets, and I think that there's something that an actor brings to directing that a director who's never acted doesn't have sometimes. In fact, I talked to both Tessa Thompson and Ruth Negga, and they said that one of the things that they thought that you were so generous as a director because you knew what it was like to be an actor. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience directing?
yeah, I mean, really good directors have the good sense to cast good actors and let them do their job. I mean, that's my feeling on that. I mean, I'm their eyes, I'm their audience, I'm witnessing them, I'm telling them what they're doing, and I'm helping them get to where they need to be. But a lot of it is, you know, is just support, really. And I think that's true. I think I have understood that as an actor. I think I've seen how it works and how it doesn't with directors. I've had that good fortune. I also witnessed my father, how he directed actors. So, you know, so I think there's some truth to that. Certainly the experience I've had on film sets is more of a, you know, is the greatest school I could have imagined.
I want to get back to the subject matter of this film because I was telling you a story about when I was growing up, I lived in a black neighborhood on the west side of Chicago, and there were two women that as kids, we always called them the two white ladies who lived down the block. But they really didn't live as black or white. They just lived, and they lived in the neighborhood. But their name was, one was about 60 or 70. Her name was Miss Roebuck, and her mother was about 80 or 90. Her mother's name was simply Adele. And Miss Roebuck would have this car drive up ever so often and deliver packages. And as it turned out, they were family of Sears Roebuck, who founded, and no one ever talked about the fact that, you know, when we talk about passing and things like that, there's so many things. I'm sure you must have had things happen when you were a girl that you wondered about why were certain people coming to your house or not coming to your house, or when they could come?
I mean, sadly, no. I was very cut off from all of it. I mean, my mother went to England and raised me there. I definitely, you know, so I didn't have those experiences. I don't know her family. She doesn't. And she knows her sisters, but that's it. Her father passed when she was 16. You know, so I don't have that experience. I do have the experience of being raised by someone who was raised by someone who was hiding aspects of their life and their identity, and the emotional legacy of a life lived in hiding is complicated.
Tell me about when you were writing this, especially tonight. I saw this movie, I had seen it before, of course, and I saw it tonight, and something struck me about Claire that I hadn't, that didn't register as much the first time. Even though she has a freedom of movement, Irene is much more buttoned up and reserved, and Claire sees her as the one with the morals and the responsibility for raising a family and living in Harlem and helping, you know, with charities. Claire seems to kind of go around like a butterfly from one thing to another, from one person to another, but her loneliness at giving up everything, giving up her community, having to live with a man who calls her a pejorative as a nickname. When you were writing that, how did you adapt that from Nella Larsen's book?
It's all there. It's in the text. I tried to remain faithful. I think the hardest aspect of the adaptation was the importance of trying to find as subtle and economical way as Larsen does in the book of guiding the audience into working out that Irene is unreliable. Because ultimately, you know, the question that Nella Larsen really raises is which one of these women is betraying themselves more, the one who is hiding her race or the one who is hiding everything else about themselves?
Like perhaps her sexuality?
Perhaps her sexuality, perhaps her who she is, how she behaves, her performance of femininity, her relationship with her husband, the truth about race in America, how she's raising her kids. I mean, we're talking about the woman who organizes the fundraiser but can't talk about race. Yeah. You know, she is the one, you know, Claire says, I'm not safe. But Irene is the one who breaks things. You know, this was my way of trying to make it somehow visually work in the movie. Is like, you know, Irene breaks a teapot, she throws a flower pot out the window, she says, I had only to break it and it was gone forever. What's her culpability in the ending? We don't know. It's up for you. It's really up to you to decide. But it's complicated. You know, the whole point about their relationship is they are two sides of a coin. You know, they could have made the same choices, but they haven't, and they're opposites, and they attract and repel each other with equal energy. And there is a love story underneath it. There is this seduction that goes on. I mean, Claire is, yes, she carries with her a seed of danger everywhere she goes because of this choice. It's real. Like the possibility of violence is present and in her life, but she is free in how she behaves. She goes through life taking what she wants and making herself who she wants to be. You know, she says, you know, you want to see me as a woman today? Fine. You want to see me as a man today? You want me to be gay, straight, whatever. I'm going to be what I need to be to get what I want. And Irene is operating under this ethics code of there is a right way to do something and is utterly bound by that, to a point where her passing for safety becomes potentially violent and dangerous. And I think that's really what Nella Larsen's getting at, which is incredibly complicated if you think about it, because she's using it as a metaphor. You know, it's like she's using racial passing as a metaphor for all the ways in which anyone is incapable or unable to match up their inner truth with their projected reality. And that's, I think, strikingly modern.
You know, I know this 15-year journey that you were on in thinking about the book and thinking about making it a film. You know, you said that when you were in England, it wasn't as much, you were probably very surprised at how much race every day in America is different. And what was the point I was making? I was going to say,
It's okay. England.
Okay, England, America. Oh,
yeah.
Yes, what I was going to say is, you know, I was going to bring up the one drop rule that back when they said, at one time it was actually in legislation that if a person had one drop of black blood, that made them black. And back then, the rule was that meant that you couldn't have property, you couldn't have certain rights, you couldn't inherit, you couldn't have an education. There was a lot about and there were even measurements, octoroons, 1/8 of blood, you know, quadroons. Yes, it was. When you think about it, race as a construct is so really ridiculous. But when you went on this journey of, and I think it's okay for me to say that you've also, with Dr. Skip Gates, sort of.
Yeah, you can say it.
Can I say that? Okay. So you actually went on more of a journey of looking into your past to find out more about your mother and your grandfather. And what are some of the things that you found out?
Yeah, well, I was begging the people of Finding Your Roots, Henry Louis Gates and that show on PBS, to take me for years. I've been like, please, and they were like, why? You're British, and why do we care? And I made this movie, and then they were like, okay, that sounds interesting. So they had me on the show, and the reason that I wanted to be on that show so badly was partially, yes, I could have found out that information through hiring detectives and DNA tests and all that kind of stuff, but I knew that their people were going to be the best, and I also knew that it was important for me to do it publicly. Very important. Hasn't come out yet, comes out in January, but I can talk about it. I mean, the long and the short of it was that I found out that my grandfather was indeed white passing most of his life. He was also indigenous passing. He passed as a chief flying iron, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. The stories are big. You'll see it in the episode. I won't try and ruin everything. But what was even more interesting than that was that I suppose in my head, or in my musing on it, I sort of assumed that the story might stop with him, with that, and it would be difficult to get any more information. Henry Louis Gates managed to find out about my great-grandfather, who turns out to have been a prominent race man. He was born enslaved. He got to Washington. He got an eminent job in government. He ended up giving, it actually makes me very emotional to talk about it. He was invited to the White House for a very famous event celebrating black people, black uplift, that time post-abolition, that President Ulysses S. Grant was there, and it was honoring Fredrick Douglass. And my great-grandfather gave the toast to Fredrick Douglass. And his wife was a free woman of color whose great-great-great-great-grandfather was one of 5,000 men to have fought in the black men to have fought in the Revolution. And Henry Louis Gates had all the names, he had all the things. Again, I should probably shut up because the episode of TV will be good. But it was mind-blowing to think that my grandfather's decision to pass erased that history. There was no access to that. My mother didn't know anything about her own grandfather. That's what I've learned.
You know, there were many reasons, I guess, you know, financial reasons, social. Some people just didn't want to have their very existence questioned every day. I'm glad that people don't have to do that today, but I'm struggling with whether I should ask you this or not.
Uh-oh.
So how do you feel, what do you feel about race and finding out that you have such a rich black history in your family as well?
Okay. You said that people don't need to pass anymore, and that's true. They don't pass, but by their own volition. I've been handed down a legacy of passing. I present as white. There is a huge irony that the violent regime of white supremacy is the reason I don't know about my mother's history. And it's also something that I benefit from as a white presenting person. So where does that leave me? Confused, yes. I can't control how I present. I can honor my history. I can make art. I can think about it. I can engage with it. Thank you.
And I am so glad that you chose Nella Larsen's book and this film to do your directorial debut. I think it's exquisite. I think that the choices that you made in doing it in black and white, can you tell us a little bit about that, the artistic choices that you made?
Yeah, the choice to do it in black and white was really when I wrote the first draft of the screenplay a long time ago. It was the first thought in my head was that this film has to be black and white. And there's a really sort of obvious answer to it, which is obviously black and white and color line. But it just made the most sense to me to make a film about colorism by taking all the color out of it. You know, if we're to think of race as a social construct, which we should, because it is, then the abstraction, putting this world into an abstract world, points out the obsession with the categorizations and also the absurdity of them. And it, you know, and also, it's an incredibly complex story. There is nothing black and white about it. It is all about the in-between space and the ambivalence and the possibility to hold one thing and its opposite at the same time. And you know, the big irony about black and white is it's actually gray. So it felt right for so many reasons. It also felt right because when I envisioned this film, there was something about the story of these two women who seemed sort of, you know, perfectly engineered for each other's destruction, and the sort of strength of them that reminded me of those sort of psychological noirs of the 40s and 30s that often had these big powerhouses at the center of them, like Betty Davis and Joan Crawford and Barbara Stanwyck and these kind of people. And I thought, wouldn't it be like bloody brilliant to make that movie, but with people that didn't get to make those movies? And, you know, thank you. So, you know, there was a little bit of a kind of homage to films that I care about, that have influenced me in the decision to make it black and white, but it was also a completely practical one. Mm-hmm. And the final reason was very practical, was because there was absolutely no way I was going to make this film without black actors at the center of it. You know, there is a history of other passing films, and the characters who pass.
Thank you so much about that, because yeah, you know, Pinky, Imitation of Life.
Yeah, they're all white actors.
Yeah, white actors who
nothing
were,
to do. Yeah, I mean, it's madness when you think back, with the exception of Freddie Washington in the first version of Imitation of Life. Mm-hmm. They're all white. But you know, I think a contemporary audience sees Tessa Thompson and Ruth Negga, and that they know them to be black women. They know them to be all, you know, mixed race or biracial, not biracial, but they see that. So that I wanted to find a way of playing a little bit of a trick where you could accept them as kind of mutable. And I think the black and white helps that, because there is a process of translation. It's not real life. You're not seeing it as you would. So that was the final reason, was to ensure that that could happen.
There's one other thing I wanted to, I know we have to end, but there's another thing that I thought about this movie in watching the little boys. And Irene didn't want to have her little boys learn about lynching or anything about race. And it just reminded me, you know, back in, you know, in 2020, when the world was waking up to the fact that in black families, you have what's the talk with your boys. You don't send your boys out without knowing something about race, or if you get stopped by the police, or, I lived in Chicago, so my family knew Emmett Till, and my brothers were brought up with the talk by my parents, so that made it seem very contemporary.
Yeah, it's something, I thought about it a lot, actually, that the sort of argument that is going on between Irene and Brian about how to raise their children is a very, it's as important now as it was then. This idea of, do you cocoon them and protect them and shelter them from it, or do you lay it out? I mean, it's a dilemma, because of course you want to cocoon and shelter them.
Anyway, I just want to thank you so much for making this movie, and full disclosure, I am one of the executive producers of the movie, and the reason that I did it was for several reasons. Number one, I love supporting women filmmakers, so I think it's great. And the other reason is I think there's so many stories within the African American community that have not been told, and this is one of them. So thank you for doing such an exquisite job with it, Rebecca Hall. And just so you know, she didn't only direct it, she wrote it, she produced it, and directed it.
Round of applause for them both, guys. Give them a round of applause.